Hi everybody. Let's take another bite out of early Rhodesian history, shall we? 1889. Rhodes now had an agreement in his pocket from Lobengula granting him full and exclusive mining rights throughout that territory, which was then known as Zambezia. The terms and conditions of this agreement, known as the Rhodes Concession, were not immediately made public. And that's because they were quite sensitive in nature and not everybody would have approved of it. Rhodes promised to give Lobengula, in return for that concession, 1,000 brand new state-of-the-art Martini Henry rifles, 100,000 rounds of ammunition, and then either a gunboat on the Zambezi or £500 in cash if he preferred. Now that's not such a fanciful thing. Rhodes, on a completely unrelated project, had arranged to have some gunboats built. Sometime during the construction of these vessels he had abandoned the idea, and they were not completed. So it was quite feasible that he may have had in mind, well, if Lobengula is attracted by that, we could take one of these, finish the thing off, cart it overland, put it on the Zambezi, and he's welcome to that. And then, in addition to all of that, £100 every month for as long as Lobengula lives. Now, I think we just need to accept the fact that Lobengula was as much a capitalist as Rhodes was, as we all are at heart. He had made quite a nice sum for himself over the years, granting permissions and permits and concessions and agreements to a variety of people in exchange for money. So he had done well out of it. In fact, there's even a legend about Lobengula concerning his treasure, and it's supposed to be lying buried somewhere in the bush in Zimbabwe today. Worth a king's ransom, they say. I remember when I was at school hearing that Lobengula, some of his people actually went to work on the diamond mines in Kimberley. And when they returned, they had to bring, as it were, a gift back to the king. And this would consist of a handful of diamonds. And I was told that at the time that he fled Bulawayo and buried that treasure, that there were 17 biscuit tins of diamonds buried there with everything else. Oh, well, whether it's true or not, I suppose time will tell. But if anybody does find it, they're going to be very, very wealthy. So that had all been done. But nevertheless, Lobengula, even though the terms were fully complied with on the part of Rhodes, he still was not happy. And he started saying things like, they came here, Rhodes's men, telling me about a queen in England by the name of Victoria and how she approved of all of this. I don't even know if there is a Queen Victoria. I don't even know if she knows anything about South Africa. So he got two of his indunas, these are regimental commanders, and he said, listen guys, I want you to go to England. I'm going to give you a letter. Okay. Officially, I'm going to be complaining about the Portuguese coming into my land. And you must give this to her and tell her that I'm unhappy about that. But when you get a chance, call her to one side and ask her, does she know anything about this guy Rhodes? Does she know what's happening over here? And if so, has she got any advice for me? How must I deal with this thing? Because I'm hearing that I've given my country away and I'm not so happy about it. So because these are Matabele warriors, I mean, they are not cultured gentlemen acquainted with the ways of polite English society, it's decided that they better send a white man with them. And they choose a very interesting man by the name of Johan Collenbrander. Now, Collenbrander was widely regarded in Zambezia as the best shot in the land. And not only that, he was the best horseman. And they say, close on his heels, figuratively speaking, as a marksman and as a horsewoman, was his lovely wife, Molly Collenbrander, almost as accomplished as he was in those arts and skills. But more to our interest is the fact that he was regarded by the Matabele as a man of great integrity. Oh, he was the final authority on all things. They called him Jawani, an affectionate name. If Jawani said a thing was right, it was right. If Jawani said this is wrong, it was wrong. They had a very high regard for this man. And he was quite capable of speaking his mind too. So Jawani and these two men set off to go and see Queen Victoria. And they have some adventures on the way, which we won't go into now. And they have a fair amount of adventures, as you can imagine, when they arrive there in England. But they do get to see the Queen. In the meantime, the Portuguese are not idle. Colonel Andrade marches in from Mozambique into Zambezia, and as he goes from village to village, he calls everybody together and he makes them swear allegiance to Portugal. They are all subjects of that great European power. And he claims that all the territory right up to the Mazoe River belongs to him. Later on, he extends that right up to the Hanyani. Now, any of you who are familiar with modern-day Zimbabwe geography will see that the Hanyani River is very far at its greatest distance from the border with Mozambique. And so this was a troubling thing. And Lobengula got to hear about this, and he wasn't quite sure how he was going to handle this whole business. And Rhodes, back here in South Africa, is also troubled by Lobengula's attitude. I mean, it was taken for granted that now with the signing of this agreement, that everybody could go ahead and fulfill the terms and conditions, and that there would be no hiccups anywhere. But instead of Lobengula putting his foot down with those dissenters within his nation and saying, listen guys, one more word against this thing and there's going to be trouble with me, cool it now. Instead of doing that, he seems to be siding with those people who always objected against this concession. And he's like turning on the people who with him supported it. I mean, they went through this thing over and over and over again. It went on for weeks. The Indunas sat and they discussed it. They went through every word of that agreement. And if you have the time, look on the internet, you'll find it there. There's nothing to it. I promise you, if you want to go and buy a motor car and hire purchase, the terms and conditions and the legal language and everything is going to be far more complicated than what you'll find in that document. Anybody that's got a secondary school education can understand it quite perfectly. And Lobengula, who was well trained in concessions by the time Rudd came along, say, right, what is it that you want from me? We would like this and this and this. And then what are you going to give me? We're going to give you this and this and this. Write it down. And write it down. And then he'd get another European from Bulawayo, somebody without any bias, and say, give me a favor, this is written in English, will you read it back to me and tell me in Sindebele what is written here? And so the man would translate it back. And in this way the king would check on everything. Okay, I said this, is this what's being written down there? And so he would make sure that what they agreed to was what went on the documents. And he had done this with the Rudd concession. Poor Helm was sent backwards and forwards between the Indunas and between Rudd. What does this word mean? What is this? What is this? So when all of this had been decided, you'd think, right, the discussions are out the way, let's get on with the work now. So Rhodes calls Dr. Jameson and he says, Jim, you better go up there. See if you can put the king in a more agreeable and a more reasonable frame of mind. Now, Jameson himself, a very interesting character. And you know, there are so many of them in the Rhodesia story. They come onto the stage and each one of them is so individualistic, and they are remarkable in in their own achievements. And one wonders, how is it that Rhodes managed to get all these, they are almost misfits in a way, together, mold them into a team and accomplish the great things that he did. One historian describes them all as one mad lot. I suppose they were in some ways. You know, we just don't see many people like that around these days. But yeah, it was Dr. Jim. Leander Starr Jameson was his real name. And you might say, well, that's a rather curious name. How on earth did he arrive at that? And it's a very interesting story. The day that he was born, his father quite nervously stepped outside the house and went for a walk while he waited the arrival of this child. And I don't know how it happened, but he missed his footing on the edge of a canal, slipped into the water, was unable to swim, and was drowning. He was in serious danger of losing his life. So then along comes a guy, an American of all things, and manages to save old Mr. Jameson, pulls him out of the water. And this man who has just survived death by inches is so grateful that when his child is born, he names him after this American, Leander Starr. So that's how he got his name. And he was a clever boy. He did very well at school. He did very well at university. You know, he had a medical practice and he was an accomplished doctor. But like Rhodes, ill health drove him to South Africa. And so he arrived in Kimberley, set up a practice there, and soon became known in that mining town. And he and Rhodes met and became firm friends. Jameson had a certain charisma about him that not many men have. He attracted people to him, and you could not put your finger on any one reason and say, look, this is why he was so popular. You know, people who hadn't met him could take him or leave him. Jameson, oh yeah, I've heard about him. But once they were in his presence, it's like they were mesmerized by this man's personality. Folk were devoted to him. And yet he himself had a sort of a cynicism about him, you know, but it was just a cloak. It's as though he took nothing seriously, but he did take everything seriously. And although he laughed at the idea of hero worship, yet he himself was absolutely devoted to Rhodes. And in Zambezia, at the capital, Bulawayo, where the king had his kraal, that's, if you like, an African way of saying his palace, nobody walked in there like they were buddies of the king. Whether you were the lowliest person in Matabele land, or whether you were a highly regarded missionary, or whether you were one of his Indunas, it didn't matter. You approached the king on your hands and knees. And the exception to that was Jameson. Jameson would walk into the king's kraal, stroll up to him, slap him on the back, and say, How you doing, Albin? And laugh. And the king would join him. Lobengula would join in at these jokes. And he was the only man who could do that kind of thing. And he's the only white man that I know of who became a Matabele Nduna. He went through the whole initiation ceremony. And he was in charge of one of the regiments, although it wasn't a full-time job because he had other stuff to do. But he had a regiment and he was an Nduna. So Rhodes says to him, Jim, I think you better go up there and see what you can do. So Jameson arrives there and he has a word with Lobengula. He says, listen, you know what the Portuguese are up to. They walking into the country. They want to lay claim to all of it. You're going to have to deal with that. You've not only got the Portuguese, you've also got the Boers. Uncle Paul has been quiet, but we all know Uncle Paul is planning an incursion into your land. You're going to lose it, Your Majesty. If you chuck Rhodes out and you don't allow him to come in here and give you some protection, you're never going to handle these two powers. You're going to go under. So Lobengula says, look, you know, I haven't got a problem with this concession. My problem is the fact that people are saying, I've given my country away. There's no problem. If he wants to come and mine, he can come and mine. But this whole idea of me just having given everything to him is not on, man. So this is conveyed to Rhodes, and he, in the meantime, has been granted a royal charter from the British government. Lord Salisbury has signed it off, enabling him to now walk into the country and occupy it. In terms of the Berlin Conference, police force, show the flag, efficient administration, all of those kind of things, Rhodes is going to put all that in place. He can now do that legally, as it were. But he's troubled, man, because despite Lobengula's reassurances, there isn't a ring of truth to it. And then there comes on the stage a man by the name of Frank Johnson. Frank Johnson, a real firebrand. A difficult man to handle. And one that you and I would think, why is Rhodes bothering with this man? Because he's had so much difficulty with him in the past. He ought to know that this man is going to be a thorn in his side. But Rhodes can see something in Johnson that other people can't. And he knows that Johnson is essential to his ultimate plans of occupying Mashonaland. And so he tolerates Johnson. Johnson then comes to him and says, listen, we can't rely on Lobengula's word. If he changes his mind and we step over the border and he decides to attack us, we can find ourselves in a lot of trouble. We ought to do something about it beforehand. And Rhodes says, well, what do you suggest? And he says, we need a flying column. 500 armed mounted men. We ride for Bulawayo. We in there quickly. We either grab him or we kill him. And that's the end of the Matabele resistance. And then you can move into the country. Well, it's not the kind of thing that Rhodes can just say straight off, yeah, that's a great idea, let's go for it. So it's left, as it were, as an option. And then Selous arrives there, and he's in a panic because the Portuguese are making very serious incursions into Zambezia now. So he's come with the news to Rhodes. The Portuguese are on the move. So Rhodes says, yeah, okay, by the way, while you're here, will you look at this? This is something that Frank Johnson's come up with. What do you think about it? And Selous looks at this and he says, are you crazy to even consider this? There's no ways that this thing will succeed. You're just it's like throwing stones at a hornet's nest. You want to right into Bulawayo. There's a whole European population there, community. What do you think is going to happen to those people? You, you just, and what are you going to do it for? There's no gold. There's nothing in Matabele land there. It's just the Matabeles living over there. That's why they raid the Shonnas for stuff. If you want to do anything reasonable and sensible, then just leave the Matabele. Don't antagonize them. Go into the country along the border between Mashonaland and Matabele land. I know the way. I'll build the road for you. I'll guide your men. I'll keep them clear of trouble. You get into Mashonaland, and there you can go and look for gold and everything, and leave the Matabele alone. I'll tell you, this plan of Johnson's is total madness. Well, Frank Johnson, of course, wasn't overjoyed at hearing what Salu's response was, and he bore a bit of a resentment for Salu from that point onwards. But nevertheless, they still worked together. So it is decided. Rhodes eventually agrees. Look, Salu's plan is the best. We're not going to attack the Matabele. We're going to go in peacefully, and we're going to go in on the outskirts of Matabele land, and Salu's going to guide the column. So, Frank, your job is, if you want it, are you going to build a road for me? There's 600 miles from the border to a place that Salu has selected called Mount Hampton. And what are you going to charge me? And the story is, Johnson said to him, give me a couple of hours, I'll work out a figure for you. So he duly came back and he said, Mr. Rhodes, 87,500 pounds is what it's going to cost you. You provide all the weapons. I need some Maxim guns. I need some artillery. You give me all of that on loan. I'll return it to you afterwards. And I will have your road built for you by July this year. Rhodes says, well, okay, but I think you need to stick around for another few months after that. I'll take possession. Hand over everything to me in September next year. And Frank Johnson says, okay, you got a deal. Can you imagine the amount of work involved? He's got to raise a whole pioneer corps, something like 500 infantry, 200 engineers. Got to find horses for them, uniforms. The whole thing was to be conducted as a military exercise. Even the civilians were given ranks and uniforms. Food, rations, training, orders, instructions. It was an enormous task, and yet he did it. An amazing task. But you know what the most amazing thing about it all was? He was 23 years old. 23 years old. Work out a budget of that magnitude in a couple of hours. Put all that together. Amazing. And he was successful. But I think what we'll do is we'll leave all that right now, and we'll continue next time. Folk have been asking me, how can they find out more information about these things? Look, the internet is a wonderful instrument, a wonderful place to go and look. I mean, if you had to go to a public library and dig out books and read every one of them and make notes, a lifetime's not going to be long enough for you to research these things. Go onto the internet, and you'll find all the information. The things that I've been talking about, you'll find it there. But I would just caution you one thing. Don't just look at the first thing that you see and accept it as being the truth. I've been very fortunate that I grew up in a country where our pioneers were all highly respected and remembered. I went to a high school where all the houses, the sports houses, were all named after pioneers, and I could see them on the walls in the mornings when we went for assembly. Rhodes House, Forbes House, Salu House, they were all there represented. If I went into town, into Salisbury, you would find Jameson Avenue, Baker Avenue, Selous Avenue, Rhodes Avenue, Moffat Street, all these places. They're familiar to Rhodesians that I'm talking to. But we were constantly reminded of our history. We grew up with it. So I'm able to more or less, okay, within reason, I can more or less look at something on the internet and say, oh, that's great, I didn't know that. Or I can say, hang on a minute, man, this just doesn't jive. There's something not quite right about this. And so what you've got to do is, if you are researching the history of Rhodesia on the internet, you've got to look at a lot of stuff, eh? If you are going to be looking, say, for example, at Dr. Jameson, there'll be quite a lot of information. Look at it all, and then you take the bulk of the information as being correct. And these odd things that you find only in one reference paper, but nowhere else, you just got to think, well, does it fit his character? Does it fit chronologically into everything? So, but you'll find it very worthwhile and very rewarding. I mean, let's face it, Rhodesia was in existence for not many more years than I am old. So it wasn't a country that was in being for a long time. But yet, at the start, it was nothing but a wilderness, Zambezia. At the end, it was a first world country. First world, self-sustaining. And that was done in the matter of about 3 or 4 generations. So it ought to be of some academic interest to people. Are there any lessons that can be learned from the example of Rhodesia today in the world? And I do believe that there are a great many. So it's a worthwhile pursuit if you feel that you'd like to delve into it. Oh, I commend you for that. Please do so. But anyway, let me stop right here. Thank you again for all your comments. I always apologize that I can't reply to them all. But thank you for your interest in Rhodesia. And I wish you all well. Take care. And we'll get together again very soon. Cheers.